philosophies. So those religion and philosophies that are working against Islam, or Islam is facing a threat from them. So we won't be discussing everything. We'll just touch on the major religions and the major philosophical debates that are taking place. And when it comes to history, there's a lot of conflict and debate on what counts as a true historical record, right? And so I'm not a historian by trade. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you whatever I'm going to tell you is going to be coming from a book, uh, Usul al-Ghazw al-Fikri. And so basically, the author of that book has researched what he has researched, and everything that I'm going to say is going to be what he mentions, right? So you might have differences in what you've read or heard before, and that's totally fine. We're not saying that everything is 100%, but that is a narrative that is present. And when you join all these things together, you find the true picture. So we're talking about the history of religion, right? And so we're going to talk about the division of religions, how they're broadly divided. And the religions that we're going to focus on is Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, and Christianity. And then lastly, inshallah, we'll talk about some of the major philosophies which have been in the past or are still present here, which are in opposite to what Islam teaches us. Now, divisions, you know, they used to be divided, like religions come even before history was ever documented. They've been there from the start of time, right? And usually they were divided based on geographical areas, right? So Nuh alayhi salam, after the Tufan, after that flood which destroyed everything except for a handful of people in the ark, right? He had three sons, Sam, Ham, and Yafith. These are the names mentioned of his three sons, Sam, Ham, and Yafith. And so basically, mankind's progeny only spread through his three sons. The other people on board with him, it was Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hikmah that none of them ever gave birth. So just like all lineages go back to Adam alayhi salam, so do all lineages go back to Nuh alayhi salam as well. So anyways, these three sons of Nuh alayhi salam, they spread out across the land in all in different areas, right? And so those people who belong to the progeny of Sam, uh, the religions that spread in those areas are known as the Semitic religions or the Abrahamic religions, right? And so Islam, Judaism, and Christianity, all three of them are Semitic religions. Nowadays, when you hear the word anti-Semitic, it usually refers to Judaism, but historically, the fact is that all three of these religions are Semitic. So they're Abrahamic religions. Uh, they were spread in where Sam used to be, right? So on one hand, you have Semitic religions, and then you have non-Semitic religions. And within non-Semitic religions, then you can divide it into two parts. So either you have the Aryan religions, like Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Zoroastrianism, or you have non-Aryan religions, which include the religions in China and Japan, the Far East, basically, right? So Taoism and Shinto are examples of that. So, like I mentioned just now, that we're going to talk about those religions that are part of this ideological warfare that is going on. So, a lot of things we won't be talking about them over here. It's not a discussion on religions per se. So, amongst the Aryan religions that we have, the two that face challenge is Hinduism and Buddhism, right? So, Hinduism was actually called originally Santana Dharma, which means uh, eternal law, right? And also, there's another word for it, Barhamia, right? Because it was associated with the god that they worship. They used to call him Barhama. The name Hindu was actually derived from the word Sindhu, which means that which lies east of River Sindh. And so the Arabs used to call people living in that region uh, Sindhu or Hindu. That's how the name of the religion changed into what we know now as Hinduism. The Hindu religion, though, has a dilemma to it because it is very difficult to actually define what Hinduism actually is, uh, for various reasons. One of them, which being that even the basic tenets and philosophy and aqaid of Hinduism are not agreed upon. They don't have a divine book, no, nor that they ever had a historically proven divine messenger, right? And a lot of their mu'taqadat, their beliefs are contradictory. So they have really nothing agreed upon, and they're mostly based on mysticism and mythology, stories of gods and stories of spirits and stuff like that. So for that very reason, it's really the nature of the Hindu Mazhab is actually very hidden, right? Even the president of India, Dr. Radha Krishnan, for example, he said about this religion that it is a compilation of different thoughts which pull and push people towards each other. But the reality is that it is very complex, very difficult, and very mysterious altogether. And this mystery is what gave rise to a civilization, right? And so it basically is totally mysterious, totally based on mysticism. There's really what we might call ilm or any academic proof behind it. So that's the biggest, I guess, Hindu dilemma that we can talk about, right? That said, but most of their sects would agree upon three things. One, that there is a God. Second, that there are Veds in which they have to believe in. And third is the belief in the philosophy of Tanasukhul Arwah. That is, that souls never die, they are reincarnated in a different form each time they die. So they basically change shapes in each lifespan, right? And Ved are basically books, holy books, not the kind of holy books that we have, but holy in the sense that they're supposedly expected, they're thought of as religious books. They're holy in that sense, but we don't really know whether or not they have any historical reference to them or any divine support of them. And on the other hand, you have Buddhism, and Buddhism, most of us know that the founder of this religion, initially this wasn't even a religion, it was just kind of a movement of disassociating people from the material world. And so the founder, Gautam Buddha, um, he was before Isa alayhi salam, like 6 centuries before Isa alayhi salam. He's that old, right? And he was actually the son of a local king and the crown prince. But after a lot of thinking and a lot of contemplation, he came to the conclusion that whatever there is in this world, attaching your hearts to it is completely useless. We weren't built for that, right? He never introduced himself as a prophet. He never introduced as being someone divine, a god, or anything. The only thing that he did was to reform the etiquettes and the ethics of the people of his time, right? And by the ninth century, Buddhism was actually at peak in India. And though originally Hinduism and Buddhism are very different in terms of their origins, But over time, they kind of merge together to become one, to the extent that Buddhism in India is almost extinct. You may find it in places like Thailand, Malaysia, Tibet, and stuff. But India, for example, has a very low Buddhist population because Buddhism got merged into Hinduism, right? Now, within Buddhism, there are three sects. You have the Theravada sect and the Mahayana. These are the bigger sects. There's one third sect which is actually very localized to the population of Tibet, but these are the two major sects of Buddhism which are more popularly known. So the Theravada, these are the people who actually took the principles that the ethical principles that Buddha gave and tried to form it into a religion. So before the sect, Buddhism was not considered to be a religion of sorts, right? And so they took his ethical teachings and tried to incorporate in it the wahi pelu, the mystical divine aspect, to give it the form of religion. And then they elevated Buddha to become a god, right? And because it originated in India in order to impress the Hindus at that time, what they did was they created a multiple gods because the Hindu Mazhab has multiple gods in it. And so the Buddhist, this sect of Theravada, they also did the same thing. They created multiple gods in order to attract the Hindus towards Buddhism. And so that's how they ended up creating a religion. And Buddhism is very widespread in Sri Lanka and Burma, but it rarely exists in its original cradle, which is India. And then you have the Mahayana group. And these are the Buddhists that you can usually find in China, Japan, Tibet, Mongolia, Sumatra, and other areas, right? Uh, they believe a bit differently. They don't think Gautam Buddha was God per se. They believe in an entity, and they say that entity reflected inside Buddha, right? So Buddha was basically a reflection of God himself, right? In that sense, he might have been an ilah, he might have been God, but in his nature himself, he was not God. It's something like the Trinity ideology of the Christians. And actually, if you ever seen the statues of Gautam Buddha and stuff, these were the people. This is the group that actually gave and that promoted that culture of statue building of Buddha, right? And so these are the two major Buddhist sects that you have here. And nowadays, you might have seen a phenomenon that a lot of people in the West, they're inclining towards Buddhism because Buddhism actually offers a spirituality without religion. And so there is a spiritual aspect to human beings, most people who don't have religion are void of. And so that spiritual feeling that they get is through Buddhist practices because it targets that area without being specifically religious, right? So you have this new concept of spirituality without religion in the West. As for most major madhahib, Islam included, spirituality comes as part of the entire package, right? So in this sense, Buddhism is a challenge because, those people who need something to fill it could have filled it with what is right. They could have filled it with Islam, for example, but they're choosing not to and choosing to fill it with this ideology, right? So in that sense, Buddhism is a challenge, and Hinduism is a challenge, especially in India, where Muslims are being oppressed. And funny story, Hindus were never actually very violent until the period of British colonialism. That is when they actually created that anti-Muslim sentiment amongst the Hindu population. So anyhow, these are the two Aryan religions, which are a challenge to Islam, and that we should have to understand and actually fight. All right, next, you have Judaism, right? So Judaism can be described as a monotheistic religion, i.e., someone who believes in one God, which was developed among the ancient Hebrews. So it is characterized by a belief in one transcendent God who revealed himself to Abraham, Moses, and the Hebrew prophets, i.e., the Israelite prophets, and by a religious life in accordance with scriptures and rabbinic traditions. So this is a very simple definition of what it means to be a Jew and what Judaism is. But interestingly enough, and this is something very old, I read a newspaper article once, and when I say old, I mean really old, it's almost a decade old. There was actually a hot debate going on within the Israeli parliament to define what a Jew is. And they had over 17 different opinions on who qualifies as a Jew, right? So although we're streamlining it down to this simple belief, but within the Jews, who constitutes as a Jew, there's a lot of ikhtilaf that's going on. But anyhow, some of the fundamental beliefs include being born Jewish. So it's a very familial religion. A lot of Jews won't accept outsiders, mean you can't actually accept Judaism, you have to be born in it. Some accept that you can convert, but only halfway. Like you always be a half breed, you'll never be the full thing. That's among their beliefs. They believe in one God, although they might believe in different attributes of God, which other religions don't believe in. They believe in the Day of Judgment, and they also believe in a universal from the progeny of Dawud alayhi salam, which actually we call as Dajjal. That's what they believe in. And that was that. But nowadays, later on, they incorporated other belief of having world domination. That's something that we're seeing today that they're working towards. They believed in the coming of this universal king, in this Messiah, but in the older scriptures, you never find conquering lands or world domination as part of their plan. This only came after the Zionist movement actually began. And so also their main acts of worship include like zabiha. So they also slaughter animals in the name of uh, the God in Allah's name. Um, 1/10 of their earnings are utilized for religious causes, either for their religious institutions or their religious movements. Like that's legit fixed. Like we have zakat, the system of zakat, they have this 1/10. And also they canonize Saturday. I mean, Saturday is very holy for Orthodox Jews, anyways, such that they don't even lift a finger to turn off or on a switch. They do it the day before. Obviously, like I mentioned, there are a lot of different Jews. Some do give it that reverence, some don't. And anyhow, but Saturday in general being something holy uh, is associated with that religion. Now let's look at the history of Judaism a little. So, as you know, that the Jews are also known as the Israelites because their story starts from Yaqub alayhi salam, whose name was Israel, and Israel actually means Abdullah, the servant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And since their lineage actually starts from Yaqub alayhi salam, Israel alayhi salam, that's why they're known as Israelites. And so Yaqub alayhi salam, he had 12 sons, and from there stemmed the 12 Jewish tribes, right? And so all these 12 tribes, with Yusuf alayhi salam, they were in Misr. And when I say Misr, remember that when we talk about Misr mentioned in the Quran or in the historical text, it does not mean just modern day Egypt. uh, what we know as Sudan today was actually part of Misr. So the Greater Misr was both Egypt and Sudan. So Misr was the entire thing. So anyhow, when Yusuf al-Islam was made the king of Misr, all of his brothers and father, they shifted over there. Things happened. The tribe of Firaun, they actually got the upper hand, tortured them, did with them what they did, and then Musa alayhi salam liberated them from the Pharaoh, right? And all this happens since the time of Yaqub alayhi salam up to 1250 before Common Era, right? Now what happened is Musa alayhi salam, he liberated the Jewish people, but the slavery mindset was such in them that they're always fearful, always doubtful, always creating problems for Musa alayhi salam. So and so that what Musa alayhi salam wanted was to bring them to Jerusalem, to Palestine. But in order to do that, they had to fight Qawm Jabbari, which were already abiding there. But they refused to do jihad. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala banished them to the desert of Tay. And Musa alayhi salam actually and his brother Harun alayhi salam, both of them passed away within those 40 years in which they were going about. So the first generation of the Israelites from the time of Pharaoh were actually delinquents. Then the later generation realized that, this delinquency is not getting us anywhere. So they rallied with Yusha bin Nun alayhi salam. And this is the same person whose story is mentioned in Surah Al-Kahf, that he was Fata Musa, the boy who traveled with Musa alayhi salam when he went to meet Khizr. And so he also became a prophet. And so under his leadership, those people actually went and fought Qawm Jabbari and were able to essentially enter Palestine after 40 years. So from 1250 to 1025, this era is known as the era of the biblical judges. So basically, the scholars and the judges of that time, they were the ones ruling the entire thing, right? And so these 4 centuries, they used to rule. And then after that came the era of the kings. And this, you could say, was the peak of the Jewish religion. This is when the power shifted towards kings. And at the very end came Dawood and Suleiman alayhim salam, who were both kings and prophets, right? So in this time period, the kings were ruling the Israelites, and that is when they peaked, and kingdom and prophethood both came together, right? But after the death of uh, Suleiman alayhi salam, a lot of problems seeped in, a lot of facade, a lot of uh, their beliefs started getting corrupted, their actions started getting corrupted. They lost their way with wahi, with revelation, and they started engaging in black magic and stuff like that. And such was the schism between them that the Israelites separated and divided into two kingdoms: the kingdom of Israel, Samaria, and the kingdom of Judah, right? And once they were divided, they never got back together again. That bad was the divide. So this is known as the era of the Great Divide. And then when the corruption got out of control, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this period in history in the Quran when He mentions بَعَثْنَا عَلَيْهِمْ عِبَادًا لَنَا أُولِي بَأْسٍ شَدِيدٍ فَجَاسُوا خِلَالَ الدِّيَارِ in Surah Al-Isra at the very beginning. That when the Israelites got out of control, we sent upon them a people who penetrated the land, a Jerusalem, and then wreaked havoc on the Jews. Right? So in 586, this is known as the invasion of Babylon. That is, and when Bukht Nasr, Nebuchadnezzar. I don't know how to pronounce this stuff. So Bukhtasar, the king of Babylon, he actually invaded Jerusalem. Uh, about 70,000 were made prisoners. A lot of them were killed, and then he took those prisoners back to Iraq, from which he came from. And Sulaiman alayhi salam's temple was also destroyed. Right? You probably heard that the Jews at near the end of the time are going to reconstruct that same temple. So that is the same temple, or the masjid, I would rather say, that Sulaiman Islam had built, which was destroyed in this invasion. Khayran, but in 539, right, this is the time when the period of restoration began. And what happened is that the Persian king, he invaded Iraq and the area of Sham, Syria. And when we again say Syria in the historical context, we mean Greater Syria, which includes the four countries of Syria, Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon. All four of them used to be the same. So historically, this is what Syria was. So the Persian king, he actually attacked and conquered Iraq and Syria, and then he allowed Bani Israel, the Israelites, to go back to the Bayt al-Maqdis. So this is known as the era of restoration, in which they were released from their slavery and were allowed to go back. Then in 3032, 332, uh, was the time of Roman and Greek conquest. So first of all, Alexander the Great, he in his raid of conquering lands also conquered Gaza and Phoenicia, right? And then after that, for about 2 centuries almost, the Israelites were slaves and they were being exchanged from one ruling government to another, right? So both Romans and Greeks, one after the other, was coming, taking land from the other, and these people were basically being transferred as property, slaves from one hand to the other. And this happened with them for almost 2 centuries. This went on until some of them realized that it's almost time because their scriptures had the prophecy that near such and such time a prophet will be sent, the last prophet will be sent, and then with him they will conquer the world. And so, keeping those signs in mind, they started migrating until they came to Medina, in which they realized that this place fits the description of our prophecies. And so a lot of Jews, they started entering Medina. Khaybar has a similar geography, a similar kind of situation as Medina. And so other Jews also shifted to Khaybar because it had a lot of date trees as well, just like Medina has. And so some of the Jews they went to Khaybar, others stayed behind in Medina. So they started migrating from Jerusalem towards the prophesied lands, right? And as you know, when they realized that this last messenger was not from Bani Ismail, not from the line of Israelite prophets that already have been, but from the Arabs, they became enemies and from the onset have been working against Islam relentlessly. And it has yielded efforts. And so, because of their relentless efforts in every country, with every region, they were able to actually establish their own state, the state of Israel that we know today. So, this is like a really brief history of the Judaism religion. Actually, if you go to Wikipedia and get the full detail, there's a really good timeline over there. I suggest that you do look at it if you're interested in learning more. Now, the main sources of Judaism are Torah, the divine book revealed to Musa alayhi salam, the Talmud, which is basically an exegesis of Torah. It's a collection of the commentary of Torah that the rabbis made, right? And then they have Kabbalah. Kabbalah is basically the Jewish tasawwuf and ihsan. So it's like the Jewish spiritual tradition. Also includes black magic, because magic is ingrained in part of the Jewish practice, especially the religious practice. So Kabbalah is basically a book on the spirituality of the Jews or their mystic side, right? So these are the basic sources we have. Torah, as we know, that it has been actually, it was a collection of five manuscripts given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to Musa alayhi salam, right? But the fact is that the Torah is no longer in its original form. There have been a lot of changes that have been made to it. And they've included so many weird things in it that it necessitates disrespect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the prophets in a lot of places, right? So, for example, they mention things like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was uh, that he gets tired. This is mentioned in Takween, for example. And they also said that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has a body like us human beings. They've mentioned this in Khuruj, right? They also said that there are some decisions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is even ashamed of that He made them, right? So these are some of the things that are mentioned in their new version of Torah. Um, and even the prophets, they haven't left them alone. Nuh alayhi salam is accused of actually having uh, being drunk using alcohol. And A'udhu Billah, Lut alayhi salam, for example, has been accused of doing illicit activities with his own daughters. Harun alayhi salam is accused of actually ordering the Israelites to worship the calf, which somebody made for them out of gold. And Sulaiman alayhi salam is known as being a king that was extravagant, and that his extravagance was the cause of the destruction of the Israelite state. And these are some of the things mentioned about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the messengers in this version of Torah available to us now. Talmud, like I mentioned, it was the Jewish religion and tradition that was transferred heart by heart until it was actually collected, compiled, right? The problem with them is that most Jews, they give the Talmud status over the Torah, which means whatever their rabbis have said or whatever the traditions have been, they get precedence over the Torah. And what this does is this allows people, ordinary people with own desires, to actually jump ship, right? And that's the reason why there was so much tahrif. That's the reason why they always had this back door that they could use to relieve themselves of any of the ahkam given to them in the Torah by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, I'll mention just one thing mentioned in the Talmud. So it says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He works for 12 hours every day. And those 12, for 3 hours, he actually studies the Sharia, he studies law in order to enforce that. 3 hours he spends actually applying that law. 3 hours he uses in a day to make provisions for the people on earth. And then for 3 hours, he actually plays with mermaids. So this is one of the things mentioned in Talmud, right? And another thing. they mention that some of the jinns, you know, they are the progeny of Adam and Hawa alayhimus salam, because both our parents, Adam and Eve, had illicit relations with these uh, shayateen, with these jinns. And so that's why some are the progeny of Adam and Hawa alayhimus salam. Ali'uzu billah. And the third source that they have is there's so much more. I mean, there's so much more to unpack when talking about Judaism, really. For example, they believe that attacking a Jewish person is the same as attacking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Hence, anything which is anti-Semitic is basically war against God in their eyes. And also that the Jews are the owners of the wealth and life of everybody who's not a Jew. All other people were created for the service of the Jews, and only the Jews are going to enter paradise. And our souls, our spirits, are actually evil spirits, not pure ones. I'm not saying a lot of this is mentioned in the Torah, like we mentioned, and not all the Jews might believe that, because there are a lot of fractions in the Jews, but some of the Jews, especially the Zionists that we know, the reason why they can so easily justify in their hearts for all the crimes that they're committing is if you have beliefs like this. When you believe that everybody else is for your service and that their lives and their wealth mean nothing, it all belongs to you, so you can play with however you want. And when they're evil spirits, when you have that belief about people, it's very easy to attack children. It's very easy to kill them. It's very easy to carpet bomb people and everything that's going on. So yeah, there are some Jews that actually hold this aqid as well. The third source is Kabbalah, which I mentioned is basically the Jewish spiritual tradition, which also includes a large portion of it includes black magic. Now, Judaism, in 1897, Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement, he actually developed a treatise known as the Jewish Protocols, right? And which he actually mentioned a whole plan, a work plan on how to conquer the world, strangely enough. And then different organizations and movements were created in order to enact that whole thing. So there's some secret organizations, uh, such as the Knights Templars. These were actually created in the Crusade Wars. So they're actually in the fifth century, at the end of the fifth century, when there was the Crusade Wars going on. The Knights Templars was created in order to protect Bayt al-Maqdis. Although a private organization, it was stronger than any European military. No European country at that time was as military strong as this organization was. And although most of the foot soldiers were Christians, the top brass of this organization used to be uh, Jewish. And by 1312, although this organization was finished, because not only were they against Muslims, they were also creating a lot of problems for the Christians as well. This organization was abandoned, but a lot of its members actually joined another organization, Order of Christ, right? And in which they used to take part in piracy. And the Freemasons, a lot of us have heard about, are basically the newer version of the Templars. And the Freemasonry are basically one of the oldest and most effective of the Jewish organizations. And their beliefs, their goals are usually very well hidden, except for the very top of the community. Not even the normal Jewish people are aware of it. And when I'm going to talk about this, you obviously have to remember that a lot of times there will be conspiracies also involved, and it might not always be historically correct, right? It's very difficult to gauge what is and what is not. But the fact is that they do exist and they work in some capacity to what we're talking about. Might not be 100% there, but they're there because we can see actually the effects and the outcomes of the kind of work that they talk about, right? So their maqasid, some of their maqasid include the protection and dominance of the Jews, right? It also includes the promotion of atheism and ibahiyya. Ibahiyya basically consumerism or individualism, in which basically you're not accountable to anyone or anything, and so you can do what you want and how you want. And so degeneracy that we're seeing in the West is basically a result of that. And so they did full what they could to promote all of this. And then you have the Illuminati. So this organization actually came into being in 1774. It's said that the people of this organization actually accept Lucifer, a shaitan, as their god, and they worship him. I'm not sure what the reality of that is. And so, anyhow, they usually choose people who are of a very high standing in society, all the wealth, all the fame, and kind of show them as their figureheads, and they promote this organization. Allahu A'lam bisawab. Then you have actually open organizations that are very well known, the Lions Club and the Rotary International, right? So the Lions Club is basically an acronym for Liberty, Intelligence, Our Nation's Safety. That's what Lions means: liberty, intelligence, and our nation's safety. And they usually it's a very exclusive club, and they only take people who have a lot of capital, who have fame, or who are experts in their field of knowledges, like really successful people by worldly standards. And one of their biggest targets is to promote secularism. I cut people off from religion. And the second is to actually pave way for Jewish domination. I build mindsets of the people according to the Jewish for the Jewish domination, right? Building a soft spot for the Jews, letting their atrocities go by unnoticed, and all of these things are like part of their maqas. And then you have the Rotary International, which is basically an international organization, which was founded by an American lawyer, Paul Harris, in 1905. And what they do is they do charity work and developmental work in different countries. And they have 157, like they're present in 157 countries all over the world and have more than 3,000 branches, right? And so, yeah, they're also working hard. And then last, we talked about how the League of Nations and the United Nations were basically created just to protect the Jewish agenda by giving international law and by creating this organization which basically controls every decision. every movement that these other countries are making. Because seriously, in 1966, 73, and 82, right? Uh, Israel attacked Urdun, Misr, Lebanon, but they haven't been reprimanded for this. They're still free, and till present day, what they're doing in Palestine, uh, nobody's able to, or at least the UN is unable to hold them accountable for anything, which basically tells you a lot that the organization is either completely useless or internally built in a way to support uh, their up support their missions, right? And so that is the problem, and that is a brief explanation of what the Jewish tradition looks like. What are the main factors that are working there? Now let's talk about Christianity a little. So Christianity is a major religion stemming from the life, teachings, and death of Jesus of Nazareth. That's what Isa alayhi salam is known as Jesus of Nazareth, i.e. the Christ or the anointed one of God, right? And this is in the first century Common Era. So basically, from the birth of Isa alayhi salam, that is when AD or CE is used, right? The sources of the Christian religion uh, is the Old Testament and the New Testament. So Old Testament, that is basically the distorted Torah that the Jews have, which also includes some parts of Zabur. So they believe, although they believe in the Old Testament, but it's more for religious purposes, not for the sake of acting on it. And then they also have the New Testament, which you could say is the actual source of the Christian religion. And the New Testament is basically a collection of 27 books, the four of which have the founding status. The Injil of Matta, Marcus, Luca, and Yohanna. But the fact is, the entire New Testament, including these four fundamental books, out of all 27, you can't actually historically prove that any of them are the Word of God. Like the dilemma of Christianity is that it never existed historically long enough for any of it to be actually preserved. So all of this is human creation that they have. Now, the fundamental beliefs of Christians, and again, there are a lot of fractions there as well, differing aqaid, but most common beliefs people know are Trinity, which is to say that God is not one but actually three. And it's a three in one. So God is one, but he's like basically three separate entities, which are all separate, but one at the same time. And honestly, this is one of the most confusing beliefs Christians have. And if you really understand this concept of how they're trying to argue with it, it's very easy to convince them that it's wrong. It's, I mean, it's the Aqidah of Trinity is logically impossible to conclude. Anyhow, it's this is their three in one God in which they have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Isa alayhi salam, and either Ruh al-Qudus, Jibril alayhi salam, or in some fractions of Christian religion, you have Maryam alayhi salam as the third part of this triangle. Then we have the belief that Jesus is the Son of God, and they also believe in the incarnation, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and these are two different beliefs. One fraction believes that Jesus is the Son of God. The other believes that he's not the Son of God, but just like one of the Buddhist sects believe that uh, Buddha was the reflection of God on earth, or you could say that God manifested it in Buddha. These people, those who believe in incarnation, believe the same thing, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala manifested in Isa alayhi salam. Then you have the crucifixion, in which they believe that uh, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed his son, Na'uzubillah, Isa alayhi salam, to be put to death, to be crucified, in order for the redemption of humanity. Right? And this happens in, oh, and not only that, after he was crucified, they believe in the resurrection, that after 3 days, Isa alayhi salam, he came back to life and then was lifted up to the skies, like we Muslims believe. But the difference is we don't believe that he was ever dead in the first place. And then we have this aqidah kafara, i.e., the belief of atonement. And the belief of atonement and crucifixion are actually related because in their eyes, Jesus was crucified because of the redemption of humanity, for the atonement of the sin of humanity. And what do they mean by sin? They mean the original sin. Other problematic aqidah, which says that Adam and Hawa alayhim salam, they committed the original sin when they ate from the tree from which Allah had forbidden. And this sin was then transferred to each and every person of the human race until Jesus was crucified and he was killed in exchange for the atonement of everybody in the world. Hence the line, Jesus, our Lord and Savior. Right? So these are some of the fundamental beliefs that most Christians hold. Uh, Now, with that, inshallah, subhanahu wa ta'ala, we're going to stop today and shall continue the historic line of Christianity and the philosophies that are involved in ideological warfare next week. So, if you guys have any questions, I would be really happy to take them.